The Fantasy Animation Podcast is a completely independent production. It is made by experts in the field. Chris is a lecturer in liberal arts and visual cultures education at King's College London and author of The Computer Animated Film, available in all good bookshops. And I, Alex that is, am a senior lecturer in film and media studies at the University of Portsmouth and author of Encountering the Impossible, the fantastic in Hollywood fantasy cinema, available in even better bookshops. We do this podcast to provide audiences with an informative and hopefully entertaining guide through the ways in which you can not only enjoy fantasy and animation, but study it, examine it, explore it, and of course, make it and have a career in it. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
And we're back from our summer holidays, refreshed, revitalised. I'm saying all this, we haven't actually gone on them yet, but...
You speak for yourself, refreshed and revitalised.
I'm picturing a future me that is refreshed and revitalised and ready to podcast, and none of those things are true right now. But
yeah. Full disclosure, it's early July, and we're about to go on holiday, as you say, but for listeners, we're done. What a lovely summer that was, and who'd have thought insert name would win Wimbledon?
Very good, very good. So we're back. Thank you for bearing with us on our break. I hope you had a nice summer as well. And we're here to kick off another season of Fantasy. I never said that before. It felt wrong as soon as I said it, but hey, let's roll with it. Another season of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. And today, Chris, what better film to kickstart the fun than Cats? Cats, the 2019 adaptation of the stage musical of the same name by Andrew Lloyd Webber. I think people probably have heard of this movie. If you haven't, it is a film that has generated a degree of controversy and conversation, shall we say. Yep. It's one of those classic box office bombs, and we can talk about the kind of politics and realities of what a box office bomb actually means. A critical and commercial failure at the time, and certainly hasn't even Andrew Lloyd Webber denounced the movie as sort of putting him off Cats. So it's certainly a film that didn't do well, we shall say, and perhaps as we talk about it, we might try and unpick why. I don't know about you, Chris. I am keen for this not to be an hour rant about how bad Cats is. We've both seen it. I don't know about you. I didn't think it was great, but I think it's probably more interesting to work out some of the complexities going on around why it's quote-unquote bad than simply kind of join the kind of mud pile that's surrounded this movie.
Sure. I didn't agree to that, so I'd written a few notes. We
can do a bit of that as well. Why not?
I think we will have to, because, as you say, it's a film that. And again, full disclosure, having seen the stage show, I really didn't enjoy the stage show. I didn't get it. I don't think it was for me. I remember the moment I realised I wasn't enjoying the stage show, and the subsequent conversations at the time with the people I saw it with, just not getting it, not understanding the plot. I really didn't understand it. So I came to this. So we're watching it, or I'm seeing it for the first time 4 years after it came out, and in those 4 years, a lot has been said, unsaid, critiqued about the film, resaid. As you say, there are people who are involved in the film who have denounced it. There are people like Judi Dench who have never seen it and do not want to see it, have only ever seen a still image of their character, and very famously, as we will talk about, I guess, in relation to its visual effects, when they're making the movie, they don't know what it's going to look like, and it seems like some of the visual effects artists didn't really know what the film was going to look like, and so when these actors are performing, however they're performing, and in front of whatever they're performing, they don't know what the character, the full kind of finished product will be. And there's something really I mean, there's a whole kind of area of film studies in relation to sort of unmade films, and this, even though this film has been made and is finished, there is something of that chaos that runs through it, which would be interesting to talk about. But we are going to have to do a bit of why I've written notes like, I don't know what any of the characters are upset about, and everybody involved should be ashamed of themselves.
Okay, I don't think anyone involved should be ashamed of themselves. I think to unpack why this thing doesn't work quite as much as it doesn't, because it doesn't work.
No.
It requires quite a lot of layers. There's an onion here we're going to have to unpeel. I'm interested in what you're saying about the stage show. So I've not seen the stage show. But perhaps if we start with that, because that's the sort of the Naples, which of course the stage show is based on a collection of poems by T.S. Eliot, and the title of which, this is a bad fantasy scholar that I can't remember the title of what this thing's called. Oh, The Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats by T.S. Eliot, which is a sort of children's nonsense poetry book. So actually we could start there. We don't need to. Let's start with the stage show, I think, and see sort of how we get to how we get to Jason Derulo doing whatever on earth he's doing in the film. So you've seen the stage show. You didn't like it. I've not seen the stage show, but it was a massive hit with audiences, right? So I think we have to assume that people like that the stage show has generated a degree of success, and perhaps that might be a good place to start with this. In that, I can't help feeling it's interesting you're talking about an unmade movie. I'm not sure what version of this movie would be made. Like, that implies that there is a sort of, I'd love to see the other version of this movie, the movie where they didn't go down the special effects route and went down the kind of costumed approach, or didn't cast X or Y or Z in it. But I'm not sure there's a version of this movie I can think of that makes sense as a film. And I think that might have something to do with the stage show, which seems to me, based on really just inferring from what I've read and the film itself, to be almost a sort of variety sketch show, right? It's more of a sort of it's not a musical in the kind of traditional Broadway narrative while songs decorate kind of or indeed songs tell the story. What we have here is a kind of vaudeville skit. Where lots and lots of the kind of nominal wraparound narrative, right? Is there's this sort of night of
this will be good.
Okay. I just started that and thought, why did I do that? I can't be bothered to get into the nincompoops and the flubidibadoops and the gradular-chords and the magicalds and all that stuff. But basically, they're having a talent contest to see who's going to win a prize, which seems to be sort of entry into the afterlife. But they're having a variety contest, and there's going to be a winner. And that's basically 9/10 of the show, right? Is that all the different cats introduce themselves, do a sort of song and dance, this is me, and are trying to win this contest, which is a very, very different sort of rhythmical structure to most narratives, right? It's not really a narrative, it's a variety show. And I think we could talk a little bit about vaudeville and the kind of the variety skit and how there's a lot of talk made about the links between vaudeville entertainment and cinema and how those two things are somehow simpatico. I think what Cats proves is they're not that simpatico. Cinema doesn't lend itself to skits very often. And I think there is a fundamental problem in this film, which is just that when you say it's difficult to understand, it isn't actually that difficult to understand. There's not much to understand, is the reality of it. In a way, it's like Quantum of Solace, Chris. People think Quantum of Solace is confusing. It isn't confusing. It's very, very simple. It's just that you're overcomplicating it when you're looking for the wrong thing. And I think that's the problem with Cats, is that Cats is actually quite a simple vaudevillian sketch show that just doesn't translate to the medium of the kind of cinematic musical. I don't know, what do you think?
Interesting. No, I'd not really thought of that. If we think about the trajectory of Hollywood musicals, the Hollywood musicals module that I've taught, the sort of standard thing is week 1 you do a big old musical, but by about week 3 you're starting to talk about narrative integration. We've moved from cinema of attraction style vaudeville exhibitionism. We've moved into the integration of narrative. So that's your standard historical trajectory to the point, and then it sort of goes back on itself where you get to, I think, the early 2000s. You get your Moulin Rouges that lead up to jukebox musicals, your Mamma Mias, where that's quite obviously just trying to bombard you with songs by a particular artist, which is kind of interesting because that takes you back to exactly what you're saying. This someone like Fred Astaire, your pre-Fred Astaire's, where a lot of his movies are credited by writers like John Mueller as, okay, this is where if you took bits out of it, if you took out the songs, you probably still have a narrative.
Yeah.
But equally the songs are really important they are the love scenes of the film. So actually, if you took I said writing on narrative integration is actually if you took the music out, the film wouldn't make sense because now the songs are actually doing some narrative work. So I like that idea of this film kind of taking us back to that early period of musicals that just feels very, very, very early, but also in film history courses where you have the week 1 of a module that we've taught, where we're talking about right at the start the emergence of particular kinds of cameras that move film away from simply sort of canned theatre, and you get camera movements because of new technologies, and then that allows a different way of thinking about space and geography, both of which are very confused in this film. I would say space and geography. It doesn't. London is something we could definitely talk about in the film. My favourite version of London is the one that's clearly filmed entirely indoors, which is this version. So I like that idea of it being used, or you almost have to unlearn some of the things you think about musicals and really go back to a sort of series of sketches and in fact that actually explains one of my notes, which is most of the songs just seem to introduce characters and their personalities, and they very rarely recur. So Rebel Wilson will be in it for a bit, and then Corden will have his number, and then Taylor Swift will have her number, and Derulo will have his number, and you never really see those characters again.
Yeah.
But maybe that's okay. Maybe that's part of how the film is constructed.
That obviously didn't work for you live, but I can see that working in a live theatre space, because it gets back to that kind of essential. Film scholars and film historians talk a lot about the integration of vaudeville into cinema, and you're right. It's often around this kind of actually the tension of narrative integration, because vaudeville isn't narrative. In fact, the whole aspect vaudeville is popular, and that's why cinema wants to kind of cannibalize it and incorporate it into its narratives. But it isn't what we would call. It's not narratively integrated. I think it's David Monod, who's a scholar of vaudeville, says that vaudeville was not designed to arouse sympathy or to get the audience to forget they were watching a performance, but to provide audiences with a highly artificial entertainment experience that made them aware at all times of the space and functioning of the theatre. So it's about the kind of authenticity of being in a room, and it can link to things like stand-up have a certain quality of that. If we're thinking about contemporary examples. Shows like Britain's Got Talent have this kind of, we are performing in a space here. And actually, one of the key things as a fantasy scholar I'm always really interested in, and others have talked about better than me, Kristen Moyne and Karen Lurie being two key examples, is the kind of 19th, 20th century pantomime, the fairy pantomime, right? Where you have fantasy being explored through this kind of vaudevillian performance, and that's in the British context you get things like it's behind you and stuff like that. It's that the performer and the audience joining in on the act together. And I can see in the right hands a lot of these cat songs done to the audience with a bit of I can see the bits where they're supposed to kind of find someone in the front row and do a bit of a skit with them, and I can see that creating quite a magical but fundamentally vaudevillian experience. I don't think any of that liveness can be communicated very easily through cinema, which is why we have these kind of the early musicals are more often than not backstage musicals, aren't they? Because the only way they can sort of narrativise these numbers is to tell the story of how they're made. So quite often what we get in these early musicals is sort of a narrative going on about putting on a musical, and then the musical, then the show happens.
Absolutely, and that's something that the backstage musical, not just of things like your Footlight Parade in the 30s, but you get them into the 50s as well. This sub-genre, let's say, or this cycle of backstage musical, which is about putting on entertainment, which allows for all kinds of interrogations. It allows for you have the workers, you have the top-down compression of the studio head or the person with the money, you have the hero, you have images of labour and conviviality and community, and this is where kind of the politics of the music, the mass ornament of the musical, if you like, comes together, and you see the machinations of a particular kind of genre. But you're never... There is always, and writers of the musical have always said there's always a disconnect between the images or the scenes of labour and the final product, because actually a lot more work went into the realisation of the final product than the images of Fred Astaire practising.
Sure.
There's always a slippery disconnect. They're not as improvisational. Well, one, they're not as improvisational because we see the labour, but the labour that's involved is never quite equates to these incredible Busby Berkeley numbers where, well, there's no way that's even taking place in a theatre, let alone anything else. So I can see actually that this music Cats works on stage because it is on stage, and that gives a very clear set of spatial boundaries, kind of political understanding of how offstage and on-stage space are being used from foreground and background, but also you're watching something that is itself a kind of talent show. So I see what you're saying. Part of the reason I don't think it translates is that the amount of times that the cast is all over the place, and I don't just mean performance-wise. I just mean people from different, classically trained actors, pop stars. Like it's just all over, like comedy stars. Luther, BBC One's Luther, is it like there's some bizarre, this kind of collection of different people. And somehow the director, Tom Hooper, has to kind of cut in and out of different kinds of performances. And sometimes people are tap dancing and we're not seeing their feet, which is bizarre. But some of the stylistic choices don't lend itself to a kind of entertainment on stage that really requires you to see everything. And I suppose part of the good thing about Cats on stage, let's say, is that you can see everything. You can see skilled performers. You never cut away. You're not going to cut away from Fred Astaire. You're going to keep him in long shot because you want to see him perform. You're not going to cut. And Tom Hooper often cuts away to reaction shots of characters or has them from the torso up, and it's almost doing a disservice to the spectacle. It's cutting out of the spectacle.
So problem number one: Cats the play is fundamentally unfilmable. Or at least
it's an odd story, but it's a simple but odd story,
and a very theatrical, in a good way, a very theatrical show that requires that space for it to kind of function. So to turn it into something for cinema would require some really radical, fundamental changes that they're not prepared to do because they've got an existing IP that they know they've got to sell to things. So that's problem one. It sounds like you've identified problem number two, which we'll now dissect, which is that if you are going to film it and not make those radical changes needed to make it cinematic, you're probably better off just kind of creating almost doing a sort of, like the Disney Plus Hamilton, right, which sort of has some cinematic flair to it, but actually is just sort of tries to create the feel of being in the theatre. But it doesn't even do that, right? It doesn't choose to go, okay, let's embrace that what we're doing here is trying to capture what audiences are feeling in the theatre and make it something that can be accessed through the big screen, because we've got an anxiety over doing that because I think Tom Hooper has an anxiety over doing that based on Les Mis, right? I remember Les Mis being exactly that, of like, every single creative choice seems to be based on an anxiety not to make this like a stage show. So in Les Mis, the case was mid-shots seem to be completely banned. What we have instead are roaring landscape, widescreen vistas or close-ups, and between the two, we shall not meet. So I know exactly what you mean. I think just on the cinematography, before we even get to the VFX, there is this desire to make it not theatrical, to make the space seem something that can only be created in a cinema. We have to dance on tables and then jump from the table to the floor and then jump through the fireplace up the chimney and then dance on the roof and all this chaotic. Well, what it does is it tries to create a sense of dynamic space which you can't create in the theatre. But what it ends up doing is creating this kind of schizoid sense of space where you feel like you're just floating in pixels. Like there's no sense of gravity or just coherence, right? Coherence to the space, right?
Yes, but it seems like plenty of musical films have a bit of story, a kind of a slightly odd and exuberant musical number, and then we get back to the story, and you go, well, that was an interesting Busby Berkeley number, or moment where Gene Kelly is tap dancing on roller skates. But now we're back into the story. That's not to say that certain emotions can't be expressed in those musical numbers, but the balance is slightly tipped in those musical numbers towards spectacle rather than narrative. But they're always in play, as Steve Neal might say in terms of genre. Yeah. Things are always in play. They're just the difference between them is one of degree rather than kind when it comes to spectacle and narrative. So plenty of musicals dip in and out of songs effortlessly, seamlessly, awkwardly, but there's a degree at which they are in some way integrated. In this film, there's never a narrative that it comes back to. It's always seemingly moving forward because of the sort of sketch show nature of the film and the fact that narrative is very rudimentary, that these cats, as you say, want to ascend to some afterlife / higher power on a balloon or something. I don't really... Yeah. There's always so that's the driving momentum. It takes place over one night as these cats show their paws, as it were, and their credentials. But there's never a narrative that the film seems to kind of come back to that the musical number may or may not have taken us out of. So as you're right, everything feels very... spatially very disorganised, also very kind of dreamlike, but in the sense of it has a lot of moving parts, and I don't really buy into the artificiality as much as I perhaps would want to. It is very confused, as you say, which is odd for a film that's very character driven, but it's not uncommon for musical numbers to be stylistically different. I think that's also what I'm saying, is that it's not unusual for musical numbers to be stylistically different, and then we come back to the normality of a shot reverse shot kind of narrative before we go off again into these incredible over the head Busby Berkeley moving geometric shape kind of things. This film is always chaotic all of the time, and that's part of I never felt kind of grounded in a story. And Hooper seems to rely on a lot of close-ups of characters looking upset. And I said I've written performances don't seem to drive anything. There's often there's a real vacant set of expressions, and some performers seem to just have one facial expression. And I do wonder whether this is a symptom of its digital quality, that everything is super piecemeal and chaotic. These could be characters interacting over 3 years or something, because of the way that these kinds of movies are stitched together. So I wonder whether, and we've talked about this on previous episodes, with these VFX films where there's a kind of a bit of internal chaos because of their digital production, potentially anyway. That's not to say that it's just not a confusing story with very confusing character names. Yeah.
So you're right. There's a kind of contradiction in what's going on here, in that on the one hand they're not prepared to tweak the central theatrical conceit that the whole thing rests upon, because there is a way you could do that, right? There's a way where you cut out some of the songs. You maybe add some. They add a song at one point, right? Which actually was quite good. I thought I'm not sure it was that well staged, but I thought the song was quite good. The Taylor Swift. Song. I think it's not her singing it. I don't think it's her song, right? It plays over the closing credits. I'll have to things like that. But so they do tweak it to that extent. They add a song, but they don't tweak it to change that inherent theatrical conceit. So they've committed to that, but everything else is quintessentially cinematic, in that everything else, as you say, is assembled through the very contemporary mode of cinematic filmmaking, which relies on none of the kind of liveness that theatre relies on, right? It's all about, we've talked to a number of academics and animators who talk us through the kind of production process, and creating any kind of linearity out of the pre-production, production, post-production things all collapsed. People can do things that end up in the final film on day one, or they can revamp something on the final day. It's all kind of fragmented and stitched together. And committing to that, at least at the level of design, of sets, of costume, I'm sure we're going to get into a minute, means that there's none of that liveness that the whole thing relies on, of people performing to an audience, is transmitted. You're quite right. What it feels like is, not only do I not understand how that table is that big in that space and how big these cats are, because a minute ago they seemed to be about the size of small people, and now they seem to be smaller than mice. Not only are those thoughts going in your head, but there's no sense that any of these people shared a space or place or time together.
Exactly.
So what am I enjoying here? Because that's what I was enjoying on the stage, supposedly, was I am listening to a performer perform, and I am the audience they are performing to, right?
Yeah. And I suppose if we can disentangle some of these things, we've got a narrative that's a narrative that's deceptively simple.
It's not a narrative. It's a wraparound device for a series of vaudeville sketches. It's probably what. But it is.
there is a partial. I think what it is that because we're introduced to a nominal protagonist in the opening scene of the film, a protagonist.
Sure.
Well, I'll rephrase that. We're introduced to one character who one thinks will be the protagonist, but then a lot of the time doesn't seem to be in the movie.
And proceeds to just watch what's happening a lot.
With that one expression, sure. And that's not a slight on these characters' performers.
We also have the Jennifer Hudson memory, the Jezebel character, who is kind of the if there is a recurring story, it's about the redemption of that character, which I don't know how much that's been more emphasised or not, but it's obviously not enough to save this thing from that essential problem.
No.
On the one hand we got that.
So the nominal story and the kind of characters. There's the issue of the vaudeville, which I can kind of buy. The sort of there's a version of this where it really leans into the theatricality, but I think. Yeah, because one of the things that's sort of underwritten a few of the points already is this issue of space and kind of geography. So the backstage musical, as a device, has the space of the backstage and has your on stage. In the classical Hollywood sense, you have your BWSs, your big white stages, your big sort of almost geographically impossible spaces where Fred Astaire performs, whilst at the same time there are musicals there are plenty of musicals with lots of stars, but Richard Dyer's written, I think, about the kind of almost the colonial elements of a musical where space is taken up and colonised by Gene Kelly, who can dance anywhere. That space he can take over, he can dance there if he wants to. And Richard's talking about it in relation to a particular scene in a museum, which has different kinds of colonial elements, but I quite like the idea of space is always available in the musical. And so this musical is everything is sung. That's also jarring because it doesn't readily afford you the split between narrative and spectacle, but it means that everything in the space wise in the film, there's no on stage and off stage. Everything is just musical all of the time.
That's a good point. That's a good point. They're all performing, but
all of the time.
But yes, they're all performing, but only rarely do we actually get a performance. We get the Ian McKellen Gus Cats performance, which kind of works a bit better because it feels like, well, one, it's Ian McKellen, and he just does what he does and fine. But at least it's on a stage. And the memory song, obviously, I mean, it's a beautiful song, but that sort of works because there's an established sense of a performance. But because there's no stage, everyone's just sort of being wacky in kitchens.
Yes. So space is obviously really, and people like Martha Shearer, who've been on the podcast before, who've talked about the use of New York City musicals. Is much more well versed than we are in this. But the space is obviously really important in the musical. It's all about backstage space and on stage space and behind the scenes and colonising spaces and using spaces being able to be there as performance spaces. In this film, there are a couple of... So Gus the theatre cat, as you say, the Ian McKellen number, and then Memory, just even though it takes place on sort of the road, that's framed in a way that suggests that this is her...
Yeah. And then there's a reprise later that's very much a performance. It's Grisabella, by the way. I got the name wrong earlier. Grisabella. I don't want to be accused of. I don't know my cats. I don't know my what are they called, cats? I don't know my cabavities for my Jellicles. I don't, and frankly, I don't care. But I'll at least get the names right. Grisabella. Yeah.
And then there's a couple of others. So there's I would say the Mungo, Jerry and Rumple teaser number, which is introducing these two sort of anarchic, thieving cats, let's say. Sure. That has a sort of beginning, middle and end, and then they have their last line and they all collapse on the bed. So there are some songs that are more conventional in the way that they... And are more likely the kinds of songs, that would appear in other kinds of musicals where you have your story and then you have your performance and then you're back into the story. Others, people just start singing, or in the case of Ray Winston's Growl Tiger, just sort of says a couple of sentences to music, and that's that. So it's really uneven and really patchy, the way that it treats its musical numbers, actually. And maybe it would work a lot better if they were all framed in the memory way, or in the theatre cat way, or in the Mungo, Jerry and Rumple teaser, framed in a way that was stylistically different, rather than people just singing all the time on the street. That's what I couldn't understand. I didn't know when we were into the real musical numbers, because all of the film is a musical number. Because I don't think there's any spoken dialogue. Maybe a couple of bits, but mostly it's songs, and so it's kind of quite relentless and quite sort of chaotic. So space is really important. What I actually wanted to say about space was about the scale, because as you said, like, the cats are all over the place and the first shot is taking us from London down into the streets of London, and I thought it was kind of quite interesting, the CGI version of historical London. I'm not entirely sure, or if it's even historical London. Everything is sort of catified, so there are real world locations like your Nelson's Column or Houses of Parliament, but everything is sort of tweaked in the way that sort of Shrek's world is tweaked. Everything's sort of slightly medieval. So Starbucks isn't Starbucks; it's something else, but it's got a little reference to when it was supposed to be set. I don't really know when this is set, but it's got a version of London that is supposed to be from the cat's perspective, but their perspective shifts all the time. Sometimes they're a lot bigger than they're supposed to be, and sometimes they're really tiny. So I think there's an issue of the design, and you can read so much on the film about its errors in kind of visual effects. Its Wikipedia page has a whole little section on CGI errors where it kind of comes to the film. Sorry, the film is released and it comes to theatres where there are bits missing, or you can see things that you shouldn't see, and then there's another version that has to be produced that tweaks some of these. So it just seems really chaotic and rushed. Yes, go on.
I'm keen to keep critiquing the visuals, because I think there's more to say. We haven't even got to the costumes yet, but I think one thing to just sort of say before we do all that, which we will do, is that I think reading between the lines of the various press narratives that have emerged, I think the one thing, because I this is a narrative that happens quite a lot, right, is that I think it can be very easy to go like, okay, well, they haven't even got the scale right. Like, what are these people doing? As if this is some sort of amateurish production of VFX. What seems to have happened, and this is just, we're inferring from the press reports. What actually happened is a mystery that I'd be delighted to find out one day. But it seems to be that there's just a complete lack of cohesion between the pro-filmic stuff going on and the visual effects departments. It went through a couple of different VFX companies, I believe. There was the reaction. There was a reaction to the trailer, right? Everyone saw the trailer and thought, "What on earth is this?" And so they tried to kind of redo it and hire another company to do it. And again, the one thing we seem to have learnt from speaking to, from practitioners and things, is it's how important it is. I remember when we did the Nicholas Loy episode on Dark way back. He was talking about being on set during Dark and advising directors on, like, if you do that shot, then that will be more complicated. If you do that shot, we can make it simpler. But and sort of there was a creative bargain between what the VFX could do and what the pro-filmic stuff can do. It doesn't seem that conversation happened in a very productive way on this film, and there might have been a sense that those responsible for the quote unquote traditional photography were as guilty of making these assumptions about VFX labour as quite often the general public does, which is they can they'll fill that in post, won't they? They'll just click they'll click the cat button and they'll turn them all into cats, as if that's a sort of off and on easy process. Because I think quite a lot of this problem could simply be that the footage that they are working with is fundamentally not suitable to this kind of process.
Yeah, no, actually, that's a really good point. That we're not talking about this film as amateur hour when it comes to its visual effects. I think one of the really interesting issues that this film raises is, I've written there's a real question here of acted labour and performance, but actually, what it really, given the behind the scenes stories that you hear of the film needing correction, it comes before a number of movies since. So I'm thinking, Sonic the Hedgehog, where they redesigned the character. Marvel.
But just on that one, one was a lot easier to do because it was for fully you just start from scratch, right? Or you tweak or you alter. This is a much more challenging process to suddenly go, okay, we can't do it like that, we'll have to do it like this, right? Sorry, carry on.
No, but all of these in accumulation. So the problems with a film like Cats, let's say, and all the stories that you hear about the errors, and the film was rushed, and some of it looks, some of it is dodgy. Let's just call it that. Some of it looks dodgy, but that's okay. That's dodgy, and there's dodgy. It doesn't matter.
It's not okay, but it's not due to. I'm sure it's not to do with lack of technical expertise or skill or labour. It's because something catastrophic happened in the organisation of this movie that was irreparable, it would seem.
But what the redesign of the Sonic character, plus stories about Marvel's relationship to its VFX artists, plus the very recent stories about the labour involved in exploitation in Across the Spider-Verse. People are talking about the animation, the artists and stuff. You only have to look up online VFX labour and you get stories, Hollywood's VFX crisis, quote, it's like being in the military, VFX workers want to unionize, VFX artists speak out against unsustainable working conditions. So there's lots and lots of these articles talk about the bidding processes that a number of a lot of our visual effects artists that we talk about themselves as vendors, that we were one of the vendors for. So all of these kinds of the bidding process that causes issues at certain stages of production, working conditions, unsustainable working conditions, the push to make this film perfect, don't do it again, do it again. These kinds of films, and I would say, because the first Sonic is, about 2018, I think, 2019. This is only a thing that's happened over the last 4 or 5 years, where almost we've had, for a long time, and we've talked about this, for a long time, motion capture was the way in to talk about digital labour, because it made those questions so obvious. We could talk about contribution and labour and human performance and computer mediation and cautionary tales about the computer overwhelming us. And for a long while, that was the way that we talked about because the notion of puppetry was a nice symbol for the structures of a studio that people are. So that was and now for a long time, that's how we talked about that. Now, I think over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a change towards thinking about vendors and thinking about the VFX artists who are often, and maybe it's a sort of just a pre and post COVID thing, because obviously COVID tells us a lot about working conditions, about being able to work from home, and all these kinds of. It reframes the narrative around whose work. COVID did a lot to reframe the value, or to reframe narratives around whose labour we value, let's say. And this has really sharpened, I think, our awareness of visual effects. VFX workers who lack healthcare, who don't have access to employer-sponsored retirement plans, and these kinds of things. So there's a few films that have started to. I mean, there's a blog post in here somewhere around these kind of emergent narratives around, and unfortunately, Cats is kind of an easy target because in places it's a bit of a mess. But as you're absolutely right to say, this isn't anything to do with the skills of the animators or the artists involved or the technicians. It's about their probably, being very flippant, it's about their lack of sleep. It's about that they couldn't get childcare that day, so they had to work in these conditions. It's those sorts of things. That's
and probably being asked to do the impossible, right? As I say, reading between the lines, if you jettison one VFX company when your trailer comes out, and then give all the footage that you have to another, and go work with it, there's certain irreparable issues, I suspect, that emerge there, just about how you shoot this stuff, how you frame it, what exactly you're asking, and how long they have to do it and stuff. Making the best of a bad job I think is probably a narrative going on here. Right?
Is that? But is that because I don't know the answer to this? But is that because in something like Ex Machina, you've got live action scenes and then you've got effect sequences, or you've got a sense in which these processes there's sort of production and post production, but actually in a live action kind of hybrid film, let's say, these processes might be able to be run simultaneously. Whereas in a film like Cats, which has its live actionness is essentially the faces, and that's it. Everything else seems to be blue and green screen, or I don't know about motion capture. I don't actually know whether this film is motion capture. I think there's another process going on here. So I guess it's just a little confused.
The question becomes, a simple question, is who made the decision to decide to make these costumes CGI cats rather than go down the sort of more practical route? And if that person didn't have any expertise in the field of VFX, special effects, costuming, that was an ill-informed decision to make. What you should have done is gone, how shall we do this? What's the best way of doing this? What's the range of options? But it seems to me a decision very early on was made that, well, on stage they do it in costumes, so we'll do it as VFX. We'll CGI the costumes on, as if those words are actually empty. We'll CGI the costumes on isn't a thing. It's like when we'll magic them on. Like, how does that work? How do you do that? What process do you go through? And it clearly, by the end results alone, that would have benefited from better consultation, because that fundamental decision seems to have created a lot of the issues here. Issues here. And the film just hasn't. There was thousands and thousands of artists were employed to do this, and no one found a solution, and probably because there probably just wasn't one, or at least not in that time frame or whatever.
Again, there's a lot of. You don't have to go far to find why the costumes in Cats are the most polarizing. A Cats movie with practical costumes instead of CGI would have solved the problem. So there's lots of the creatives coming out and saying, well, actually, we tested practical costumes and we realized that CGI was sort of the best way to go. Fine, but the actors need. Without costume, you move in a certain way depending on the costume that you're wearing. So it doesn't make sense. If you're wearing something heavy, that would affect your move. So you'll need to be in a kind of strike this creative bargain with the clothes that you're wearing, because that will inflect your performance. If you're just wearing, as all these behind-the-scenes shots show of just green onesies, you don't know the costume that you're wearing, so you're not really performing with it. And in fact, these aren't supposed to be costumes. These are supposed to be just the cats, the bodies. We call them costumes because in the theatre the characters the performers are wearing costumes. But these are supposed to be what the characters are like and how they move. And that doesn't kind of, in theatre, when people use costumes and makeup, it's supposed to enhance the performance. It never gets in the way of the performance. In film, it sometimes seems to get in the way when we ask questions about, are they really performing? Are they really Well, yes, they are. Yeah. In a film like Cats, at the same time as the film comes out, or in the lead up to the film, you've got the stars coming out and saying that this is what we were really wearing. Wasn't it hilarious? Ewan McGregor doing the same thing. I was acting to a tennis ball on a stick. But the costume thing really... That's the thing that makes the movements a little bit clunky. And in a film and a musical that's very bodily, and it's about the movement of bodies, and I mean, it's also just humans pretending to be cats. And I think that's just it's just odd.
Another problem is that we are currently experiencing sort of live an industrial realization about the rhetoric of what we need is greater realism. What people want is greater realism. What CGI can bring us is greater realism. It's starting to kind of fold away as more and more of these mistakes are made, which is that it depends on the story, right? But we don't want realism in a story of singing cats trying to work out how to get into the afterlife whilst running around London. We don't want realism. We might want immersion. We might want all these other words that we could use to describe it better. But what we don't want is a photorealistic cat standing on two legs, looking like Taylor Swift. Apart from because that doesn't make any. Just literally saying that out loud reveals the contradiction of what you're talking about. Is that you don't want that. That isn't what you want. You want a real sense of artificiality, beautiful artificiality that allows you to immerse yourself in a fantastical structure. What you don't want is to count the number of nipples on Jason Derulo as he stands on hind legs and sings a song about whatever he's singing about, because that's just confusing. In the same way that you don't want a photorealistic lion to sing a song to you. Photorealism has limits, and fantastical stories, which have traditionally been told through very unrealistic mediums. I mean, the thing's a musical. That's not very realistic. We tell these stories unrealistically because that makes them easier to understand, to immerse ourselves in, all this sort of stuff. This idea that we want everything to look like a photograph is only true if things belong to the order of the real, and none of this belongs to that. So it's uncanny to watch. Hang on. So is this a cat? Is this an anthropomorphic cat? It's back to what you're talking. Is when we've done podcasts about anthropomorphism, right? Is this Honest John or Mickey Mouse, or is this Pluto I'm looking at?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Which am I looking at here? And the answer is I'm supposed to be looking at Honest John, but you've designed him to look like a real cat, a real fox, with it doesn't. That fundamental misunderstanding of the basic aesthetic appeal of fantasy is just madness to me.
I feel like especially with CGI and CGI aesthetics, you get every 10 years or so you get these debates surface again. So you get. Once Toy Story comes out, Toy Story, then Toy Story 2, you get a couple of... Then you get a Shrek 2001, and you get scholars going, so Princess Fiona and realism, and do we really want... Is that what we want? Is that what we... We all know what a human looks like. I don't really know what an ogre looks like, so maybe animation should stay within the realm of fantasy, let's say. I remember 2006, 2007, Vivian Shobsack writing an article, a chapter in a book, Animated Worlds, and she just had a simple sentence, which was, what do we want from animation? And this was in response to Final Fantasy. So Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within. So again, 2001, a film that uses hyper-realistic imagery. Well, do we want that, or do we want The Incredibles, which is a little bit more caricatured? And so these and then... Yeah. Then a film like Cats reignites exactly these kinds of debates. Well, what do you actually really want? Why does everything have to belong to the world of the photographic?
We can want both. Like, I've got a problem with animation being used to achieve photorealism. In fact, that's a really great thing for it to do, and we've talked about examples where it does do that. I just don't want that in a vaudeville show about singing cats trying to compete to get to the afterlife.
Well, obviously, not quite.
Call me an extremist, but I don't want that. And no one ever wanted that from the stage show. No one ever walked out. I mean, whether they liked it or didn't like it, you didn't like it, but you didn't walk out of it and go, do you know what? I'd have got into that more if they were really looked like cats. Like, they really, if I couldn't, it was really bad. I could see Elaine Page's face. What was all that about? The Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz, he looks like a human. Of course it does. Like, of course.
I wonder whether Cats would have been, this version of Cats would have been a lot more successful had it gone down the Oliver and Company route and been in an animated film with Judi Dench and Ian McKellen, and then you go, okay, fine. I don't have anything. I'm judging it an alternate type. This sort of hybrid, because it's photorealism plus something else. It's like a monstrous transformation of photorealism because it's sort of like the Moulin Rouge where they project Paris on the green screen and stuff like that. But that's supposed to be really theatrical, and the film sort of plays with the idea of theatrical space and spectacle. Whereas this film is trying to be really sincere and comes across really is trying to be sincere and comes across as insincere. And there's a lot. I put everything seems insincere and superficial, and rather than an uncanny valley, it feels just like a massive chasm where the VFX kind of looks unfinished. I don't know. I've just then I've ended my notes with a real dog's. For a film about cats, it's a real dog's dinner.
Hey.
So I mean, look, we're being harsh, and it is an interesting film to watch and to talk about, just because in a film that was released in 2019 with the people that are in it, the creatives that worked on it, and the director, you'd go, "Cool, this is a really interesting case study in how not to maybe navigate digital aesthetics and the possibilities of digital movement and digital bodies." It's just a really interesting, and there are other things that we could talk about with regards to race, and I was looking at some of the casting choices and how they've sort of moved through time, and Jennifer Hudson and Jason Derulo, and there's some interesting stuff that and Idris Elba that one could say about the design.
I don't know about this. Well, I don't know what's been written on this.
No, certain characters. So Grisabella, for example, sort of at some point this is going to sound really odd, but I'll say it anyway, goes from Elaine Page to Nicole Scherzinger. And this, in the same way that Aladdin, the genie in Aladdin, when performed on stage, is almost entirely performed by a black male. Yeah. Just really interesting sort of casting decisions about and there are books around, and we've talked about this kind of black masculinity and hyperactivity and animatedness, and there's a book by Sean DeGuy called Ugly Feelings, which is about the hyperactivity of Eddie Murphy. It's a really interesting kind of case study, and so it sort of in some ways makes perfect sense that the genie would be played by black males, given that the way that black masculinity has been theorized in terms of animatedness as a quality of hyperactivity. Think Eddie Murphy in Beverly Hills Cop, and and even the donkey in Shrek, which has its own kind of problems. So if you look at some of the casting practices from the stage show and how over time there's been a bit of a diversification in the kinds of bodies. So we go from Paul Nicholas to John Partridge to Idris Elba. So there's just Idris Elba plays a different character, but there's just some interesting moves that the film makes, and I'm not entirely sure it reconciles that with some of the designs of the characters, because a lot of the black performers in the film become black cats, and there's just some interesting choices that we haven't got time to talk about, but. It's
interesting to raise. I didn't know about the backstory of the casting and things like that, but I obviously knew Elaine Page is now played by Jennifer Hudson, and there are some decisions by that. Interesting.
Well, I don't have anything meaningful to sort of say about it, but so Grisabella, Elaine Page, then got Nicole Scherzinger, Beverly Knight, Leona Lewis. So just some interesting choices that are made that people more interested and interesting than me can talk about. But again, I don't really have anything to say about that. But I think whenever you're dealing with animals in films, and especially kind of animated, however animated these are, I'm always reminded of a book that we've talked about, Paul Wells's book on animated animals, the way that animals sort of can stand in for different kinds of bodies. And when you add voice work into the mix, when you have Eddie Murphy voicing a donkey, one needs to think about the kind of identity politics around those sorts of casting decisions. There's a really good. The Wikipedia page has a really good kind of breakdown of the original cast, and then sort of moving through the different versions of it, and then obviously the film doing something different, and how positive some of the steps are, but how problematic some of the other steps might be.
Yeah, interesting. It seems to be there was obviously a cultural moment where the character was shifted, and why that happened and why it stuck is also it was sort of interesting. Okay, now the character is cast predominantly black, and we are interesting. There's probably lots of other stage shows and things that have been. Well, I guess the good thing about Cats as a case study as a musical is it's been so long running that it's able to kind of take on the baggage of various different shifts in culture and society and things like that, because it's most stage shows last a year and then disappear if they're lucky, right? So
this one is what year are we? 5th longest running Broadway show and the 7th longest running West End show. So it has origins I think early 80s. So.
Obviously works.
But I'm interested to know where, because I think it premiered. This is a really wild. So it premiered in May 1981, which is obviously this is a real leap, but it's like the year before Tron, and it's the year before some of the other sort of big effect. And there seems almost like the stage show is really reclaiming the theatrical and costumes, and in a world of increasing digitization, I imagine there's something quite interesting about how that stage show was perhaps sold as no, the theatre, that's the place to be, and that's where all the effects and the magic, and who would know that goodness knows how many years later Cats has succumbed to the digital wave of
and I think there's something about participation in the magic as well. That's certainly how pantomimes work, right? And that's this idea of the way magic is created. I mean, the best example of this is like, you know, that scene in Peter Pan in the original stage show, and it's in some of the movie adaptations where Tinkerbell's dying, and Peter literally needs the audience to clap to get Tinkerbell to come back to life, because you have to clap your hands if you believe in fairies, and that will bring her back to life. And there's literally a moment where Tinkerbell is restored to life on stage if the audience participates. And I think that's kind of a nice metaphor for how these sort of fantasy pantomimes work. You know, it's behind you. To me, you know, all that. I was about to say to me, to you. That's just chuckle vision. But it's behind you, and throwing sweets and getting the kids up on stage to do it, like that sense that we're creating something together here, and you're part of the equation is so fundamental. And I think there's something quieter but it's significant about that with Cats, which is like, you know, we're not claiming that these are cats. If you want, you know, to make them cats, kind of metaphorically, the audience has to kind of do some of the work here, and the film won't let you do any work. Well, if the work you're doing is much more, I'm sorry, how big's the table, and all that, and yeah, exactly. How long was he on set, and why did she agree to be in this, and why did they cast a ballerina and then not have her body and do any dancing, and all that kind of is the sort of more what you are filled with. So rather than participating in the make believe, you are just befuddled by the kind of logical inconsistencies of what's going on. I have two other points. I guess one is the I suppose back to the anthropomorphism, is that I noticed that the characters have a lot of moving parts. So whenever they speak, kind of ears and tails have to move almost independently and in reaction to spitting, and that can make for a really kind of disjointed performance, because I don't know. I was just very conscious of these sort of floating heads that seem to be superimposed into bodies that may or may not have been the actual bodies. I think at times I thought, oh, that is Taylor Swift's body, the way that it's moved. But then in other scenes I thought, oh, I don't think that's the... And so there was a little sort of an internal chaos. And the other thing is kind of the final bit of the film where Judi Dench's character kind of addresses the audience and says, you've learned about our cats and our habits and our habitats, and I thought, have I learned about these things? And I thought that was an odd moment to sort of directly look at the camera, almost to try and go, look, okay, so we're trying to reclaim the artificiality and the theatricality, and go, look, we know it was a show, and hey, you enjoyed it, and I thought, was that filmed just before it was released, to quickly tag that on, or it was just an interesting way. I could have done with more than that. I could have done with more of looking at the camera, involving us. I could have done that. I could have done with a lot more of, because that's what you're getting in the show, right? Is you're getting memory sung at you, not sung. Because basically they have two options. They either sing it at nobody, which they do for quite a lot of the movie. They just sing, and you'll go, okay. Which I don't mind that in a musical. It's just this one, it just doesn't quite. Why are you singing a song of how great you are whilst running around in a kitchen playing with spoons? Like, don't understand that. Or they're singing it to another person on the screen. That works a bit better, but it never quite captures that. You know, I imagine it's quite a moving moment in the theatre to sort of be sung memory at. And you kind of get that a little bit with that number, but it's just dissipated through all the reasons we've said so far. Sorry, and what was the other point?
No, that was that one was the moving parts, and one was. I mean, I don't think I've got anything. No. I mean,
do we have any nice, like any good bits? I mean, I've tried to mention a couple that I think work a bit better. As I say, I think the Taylor Swift song, "Is It Beautiful Ghosts," is quite a nice song, and a way they kind of bring that together with memory, where they do that bit. I thought that was all right. Didn't mind that. There's a couple of moments that feel a bit more stagey and in a good way. I didn't mind that last bit in Trafalgar Square where the sun comes up. That's sort of okay. That sort of felt like an actual bit of space and all that kind of stuff. But what about you? Any bits that we can say nice things about?
Okay, so, well, a lot of my first... Okay, I think, first of all, I think it is possible to overlook perhaps some of the... And again, reviews have talked about it as a kind of just a bit of a misjudgment in terms of some of the design choices and kind of confusing scale. Some of the singing is obviously a bit patchy because some people aren't singers, which kind of is fine. The accents, obviously this is set in London, but that causes some problems. Yeah,
I never mind patchy singing, actually.
No.
It's not an ideal, but I'm never... Because I would rather feel a sense of a performance. You know, I don't necessarily go to musicals to hear the world's best singers. I go to musicals to hear songs sung in a kind of emotional narrative. I've always stuck up for Russell Crowe in Les Mis, for example. I mean, I'm that guy. I think there is something about the vulnerability of his voice that kind of adds something to that character in a way that I'm not that interested in Hugh Jackman singing Bring It Home when I know Alfie Boyle's just a little bit... Alfie Bowe is just a little bit better, you know.
Yeah,
so,
no, I think that's fair. I think
there's something about Ian McKellen, all right, is sort of crackling his way through it, but that kind of adds to the charm a little bit, you know.
Yeah, there is one musical number I like. So it was around kind of 45 minutes. It's a dance number that appears after Judi Dench and then Ian McKellen's first appearance, and actually it's not a musical number. It is just a dance number. So it's a sort of ensemble Busby Berkeley style, which I thought, okay, and I think the film is at its best. And even there's another one at the end, I think, where all the cats are. I think before Idris Elba's character, whose name escapes him, McCavity. Before he's sort of rejected as the kind of chosen cat, there's a couple of musical numbers. Sorry, a couple of dance numbers. So I thought, okay, the film was on surer footing, but it tries to follow quite closely the theatrical show, and I wonder whether they perhaps needed to go. They either make it an animated film entirely, or they go the other way and do a different version of it, where there's spoken dialogue and there's different kinds of music, or just do something different with it. It's caught in that liminal space between trying to be cinematic and also trying to really be a cat's movie. And even the poster is, and the font, the design, they're supposed to mimic the stage show, and it doesn't quite. It's caught in that liminal space, that sort of tension.
Absolutely. I think that's a terrific way to end the conversation. Is that it's caught in that liminal space, and you feel it every second on screen. So
But there we go. Look, interesting to talk about, though. Certainly interesting.
So that's why it's bad. And it isn't a good movie. I don't think we've claimed that, but I think there's lots of context surrounding it that are interesting to talk to. As this is a phrase you say to me when we often is it's a good film to teach with.
Yes, if you want an article or a little blog on sort of speaking with some of the people involved. There are rumours that it may become a sort of cult classic. I don't think that's going to happen because I think it's too mainstream for that.
It's also just very boring. Like it's not revolting or all this kind of stuff in the way that some cult classics become. It's just really boring. Like so I don't see that happening. But hey, who knows?
A good one to teach with, Al.
A good one to teach with. All right. Well, welcome back to another season, everyone. Thanks for listening through us. If you have other opinions on cats, maybe we have some cats defenders out there who want to write a blog post for the website explaining actually how this is a misunderstood masterpiece. In which case, get in touch at fantasy-animation.org. You can click on the Contact Us tab on the main website. And on that website, you can also find our back catalogue of blogs. Do we have a review of Cats? I think we did do a review of the Cats at the time.
Yes, we do, and we have a review of Cats by Martha Shearer.
By Martha Shearer, former guest of the podcast, so do check that one out as well. I don't remember her liking it, if off the top of my head. In fact, I'm pretty convinced she did not. But I'm sure, she did have some extremely well-rounded reasons. Yeah, probably better than what we've done on the podcast.
Well, yeah, put it this way. The first line of her review is 2019 was a bad year for cats. Deaths of notable cats and cat owners, political defeat, and finally, worst of all, Cats, the film. Okay, fine. So there we go.
So she didn't like it, but she's an esteemed scholar of musicals who will explain exactly why, and probably another reason why it's a problem. So do check that review out. You can also download the archive of podcasts, and you can subscribe to the various feeds. However you download your podcasts, you can do that there. You can suggest episodes for Footnotes at Fan Anim Research.
Yes, please do.
FANANIM research@gmail.com. That would be great. We've got a few trickling in, and we're responding to them as quickly as we can. So thank you so much to everyone who's done so already. And what else can you do? Oh, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at FANANIM Research. Same handle, FANANIM Research, and you can talk to us on that. Otherwise, that's been us for another episode, and we will see you next time.
Bye.